Professor Scott Frickel, thanks for being with us today. You are a professor of sociology with the Department of Sociology at Brown University. And of course, the users of our Ignorance archive here at CAFES are well acquainted with your numerous and important works. But would you mind introducing yourself in a few sentences for our viewers today?
Sure. Well, thank you, Mathias. It's great to be here and to join this program of yours. I am, as you mentioned, a professor of sociology at Brown University. I also have a joint appointment here at Brown in the Institute at Brown for Environment and Society. So I'm a professor of sociology and science and environment and society, rather. And I've been here for about 8 years. My work, in addition to studying ignorance, sort of more broadly, I think about my work as falling at the intersection of nature, knowledge, and politics. And so ignorance figures centrally in that confluence of ideas.
Thanks a lot. Of course, today we'll focus mostly on ignorance, but it's well to have in mind all of this larger context. And so to start, some of us have discovered your work through a seminal series of papers on the Hurricane Katrina between 2007 and 2014. But this was by no means your first work on ignorance. And so I would have several questions around this first step in your career. For the first question, in 2014, in a very interesting text, Not Here and Everywhere, you identify a blind spot in STS when you say lots of knowledge that could be made isn't, and when knowledge circulates, it doesn't do so uniformly. And of course, that was a criticism of some versions of STS. And in the same text, you add, I think it's important for today's interview, you had, in fact, scientific knowledge is not here and everywhere. That's a reference to Steve Shaping. And STS should have interesting things to say about how and why that is. I believe a reformulation of the problem is needed, one that better highlights the relational dynamics of knowledge production and non-production. Why are certain kinds of scientific knowledge created, certified, and circulated, while other kinds are not? And so if these lines are published in 2014, would you think that they would also fairly describe your 2006 book, very important book on the new political sociology of science, institutions, networks, and powers, and its critical take on and off STS?
Thank you. That's a good question to get started. So clearly, I guess the way that I can best answer that question is to say that my thinking about ignorance, which came sometime later than the earlier work, has been much informed by the arguments that Kelly Moore and I made in the introduction to that edited volume on Political Sociology of Science, which is to say that science has a political economy, is structured by a political economy in which interests and power are very much central, that mistakes and errors and oversights are not random, but they tend to align with the way in which power and authority is structured within institutions, scientific institutions, and within the larger system, cultural system of science. That would be sort of, in a nutshell, sort of the basic political sociological view of science that we begin with in that book, and then make arguments sort of about the importance of thinking about bringing those sort of large sort of macro political economic questions down into the realm of the mesoscale of organizations and networks, which in itself was, a critique of the constructivist case study approaches that were very dominant at the time, which tended to feature small groups of idea makers, small groups of experts working together collaboratively or interactively. And the view was, from our perspective, that if we pan out and scale up a little bit, those power dynamics come better into view. And so in that context, the ideas that myself and others began developing a bit later about ignorance very much fall into that political sociological framework.
Thanks. And I will come back to the text on the Hurricane Katrina, but before that, there is also a lot on ignorance in chemical consequences. And this time, so in 204, with a stress on ignorance, institutions and collective action. And so this early work, if I may say, how would it fit with your later work on ignorance? Did you have ideas at that time that developed later on in your more mature work on ignorance? On what's the relationship between this work in 204 and the later work on ignorance?
Yeah, that's interesting. So you're asking me to reinterpret earlier work through this lens of ignorance, which is not something it's a sort of thought exercise or intellectual.
It's just a question
that I haven't done before. So I appreciate being put on the spot like this and given this opportunity. So in chemical consequences is a study of I would say the social history of the rise of genetic toxicology in the United States in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. The argument in that book, or the main argument in that book, is that producing or generating the institutional contours of an interdisciplinary environmental health science was mobilized along similar dynamics that social movements and political movements take in the larger society. Those were the ideas that the concepts that I was working with in that book were drawn largely from social movement theory. But sort of rethinking that case through the lens of ignorance, it's very clear to me that what I was studying in that early, which was my dissertation project, was what we might now call the development of undone science. So thinking about it through those lenses would be a study or a story about how a small group of geneticists became concerned about the genetic impacts that chemicals circulating in the environment were having on human health, in particular heritable effects and genetic mutations, and organized a field to address those concerns. And so the concept of undone science that David Hess really coined several years later, but which we and others have worked on since then, is very much in line with that earlier story. Undone science is a concept that addresses the processes through which unasked questions in science get asked, and how research agendas are shaped to address the gaps in knowledge that are everywhere, but not every gap is not every knowledge gap, and probably most knowledge gaps are not being addressed in any kind of systematic way. When that does happen, that's an interesting sort of sociological puzzle. How does that happen? Where and why and when Do those small sort of collective movements emerge to address those knowledge gaps? And I guess the other thing to say there is that the Chemical Consequences book was really focused on a small group, Harry Collins might call a core set of scientists working not primarily in academic settings, but in national laboratories in the United States. And so and a different sort of piece of the puzzle of that book is that the national laboratories did not have the same kind of reproductive capacity that academic disciplines have, in the sense that they're not training genetic toxicologists. So the puzzle becomes, how do you reproduce this expertise? And so again, using social movement theory to sort of tell that story is what that book is primarily about. But I think you could read it retroactively or retrospectively through the lens of undone science as well, as you suggest.
Yeah, thanks. That struck me when I was rereading some book of yours when preparing for this interview. I was thinking, oh, it's already undone science. We have collective action, scientists, activists, and many features that would be developed later on. So, thanks. If I move a bit in Untangling Ignorance in Environmental Risk Assessment, co-authored with Edward in 2014, and it comes on top of a lot of publications on the Hurricane Katrina. It's impossible to summarize the paper in a few words, but you address several major issues, and I see at least two of them that are striking. The first one is that risk assessment literally creates ignorance insofar as less and less knowledge in case of an emergency or a catastrophe will count for more and more in our response. That would be a first feature. And of course, the second one, and you mentioned the phrase or the term just before, at every step we meet undone science. Some substances are undocumented, for example. It's also the case too for cocktail effects or many features that we have to deal with. And so I have several questions around this series of papers. First one, when did you decide that framing things in terms of ignorance was interesting? Because this time we have ignorance in the titles of the papers, or very early on in the text, the substance of the papers. And so, first question, so what were your main references in terms of ignorance studies at the time? Why did you think it was a good idea to frame things this way at that time?
So this is actually a very personal question, because I was in New Orleans working at Tulane University when Hurricane Katrina struck. So I was part of the million or so people who were dislocated by that storm. I was my family and I were among the first few thousands to come back to the city in the aftermath of the disaster, and to pick up the piece and to begin picking up the pieces. And so my views on this were very much informed by that experience. The first essay that I wrote that used the term ignorance was a short piece that I did for the Social Science Research Council that at the time was being led by Craig Calhoun, who commissioned a long series of short essays by people sociologists about the disaster. And I wrote that essay in the weeks after, maybe in a month or so after the storm had hit. I was not in New Orleans at the time. I was with my family in Philadelphia. And like most other people, getting what information I could from the news and from websites, and looking at images of the floodwaters and large pools of glistening oil and gas floating on the surface of these floodwaters, and trying to write something that sounded reasonably smart about what I was seeing. But there wasn't a lot of, so I wrote an essay about toxic soup and the organization of ignorance, which ended up becoming a journal article. But the original form of that paper was this online essay. And at the time, I hadn't done any work on ignorance. I didn't know it was a topic for sociology or STS. And in some ways, it was very much written in ignorance, my own ignorance about what was out there. I hadn't read Smithson, and I hadn't read Proctor's. Well, I had read some of Proctor's early work, but it didn't. When I was writing this, I was panicked. I was angry. It was a very deeply personal sort of intellectual experience. And I just went to, the words just came to me. And it wasn't until later when the essay got sort of developed into an article that I realized that there was a literature out there that I needed to address. But originally it was a word that just felt appropriate to use in the context of the sheer destruction that the storm created erased any kind of baseline knowledge that we had about the city, about the environmental impacts and environmental consequences of what that destruction did. And so it was out of that kind of deep emotional space that I produced that first essay, and became interested in the topic, and began then to read and discover the work that had already been done.
It's interesting because even if it's at first rooted in personal experience in front of a catastrophe, we see that there are both the individual and personal level and of course the collective level, the level of institutions or organized or regulatory science. And so you also mentioned the important topic of undone science, and we had for example, here an interview with Soraya Boudia, or earlier on with Nathalie Jartz and some scholars here in France. And how do you see the complementarity between your own work and, for example, David Hess's research on that topic? How would you tell the resemblances and differences? Because I think that there are differences too.
Well, David and I have worked very closely for a time. We worked very closely on thinking about undone science, working it into an article for Science, Technology, and Human Values, but also an edited volume we did on fields of knowledge, and where we were really trying, again, to develop the political sociology of science more so than ignorance, and thinking about how, taking almost a kind of a Bourdieusian sort of approach to think about how the scientific field and the political field and the economic field and cultural field sort of interact to shape power dynamics in science, again, with a lot of focus on agenda setting. And so my work with David is, I would say they're highly complementary, and I'm not sure that our views differ all that much. David is, in his take on undone science, I think, has always been very focused on the extra scientific collective action that draws out or raises awareness about knowledge gaps. And in this sense, I think his work is very complementary to the work of Phil Brown and Phil's students, who have written a lot about environmental health movements and the way in which patients groups, advocacy groups, or environmental groups raise social questions about the potential consequences of environmental hazards of one sort or another, and pointing to the responsibility of science to help us understand what those consequences might be. So I don't know. I'd be interested to hear if you think there are important differences or distinctions between our work that differentiates our work. I see us sort of as traveling quite closely together on down that path.
No, that was a question. I see both works are highly complementary in nature, with perhaps, but I might be wrong, I'm less of an expert than yourself, perhaps more of a stress on collective mobilizations in Hess, and perhaps a bit more attention to the empirical condition or descriptions of undone science in your work and in later work that we will mention later on in this interview, for example, in Cities Unseen, or this kind of work where you pay a lot of attention to the microstructure, the spatial conditions, or the material and empirical conditions of undone science. But perhaps it's just a difference in emphasis or angle or perspective.
Well, I would say, in response to that I guess my real concerns and sort of intellectual interests lie in thinking about how, and I've mentioned this in earlier papers as well, but I think it comes through in Sights Unseen, which we can talk about in a bit, but thinking about how institutions generate ignorance, not as a divergence from normal practice, or as some kind of sort of organizational misbehavior, but rather as sort of the normal conduct of scientific business generates ignorance. And so how does that happen in institutions? And can we distinguish that sort of routine production of ignorance from the kinds of strategic ignorance that Lindsay McGuey talks about, for example? Or how do those different ways of ignorance production combine and compound? And that is another. So I'm interested in how organizations or institutions generate ignorance as a sort of in the course of daily routines, and I'm also interested in about the sort of temporal and spatial structure of those processes. So, and you referenced a paper on risk assessment earlier. In that piece and in other work as well, I'm really interested in trying to understand how ignorance becomes compounded over time. There's this idea, I've used this sort of metaphor of architecture to sort of try to think about this a little bit. And I haven't done a lot of work in this area, but it's an area that really intrigues me, which is to think about how ignorance layers on top of itself over time, and perhaps spatially as well. I've written a little bit about how places take on certain forms of ignorance at certain times, and how that compounds, the knowledge production or lack of knowledge production in a particular place or in a particular institution. So I think that kind of institute, how institutions work, in my case, how regulatory agencies operate to generate ignorance, more or less systematically through risk assessment practices that are standardized and codified in law, actually generate all sorts of ignorance that continues to have real consequences, but also that also take different forms and different sort of social shapes. I'm talking very abstractly now, but if we talk about sights unseen, I think we could sort of concretize some of these ideas a little bit.
I think we can address some details, because I think they are really fascinating in your writings. Just before that, since you mentioned architecture, I was struck when you gave a lecture here at ENS in 2016. It was on architecture of ignorance. And I remember you had a definition of ignorance in that text, in the abstract that circulated. And I would just mention it to see if you still stick to this definition. I think that you said, my thesis will be that ignorance is a social structure constructed and reproduced by institutional norms and practices and legitimated by historically specific configurations of economic and political power.
I like that. I hadn't looked at that. I hadn't looked at that talk in probably since I gave it. I think that's the work that I'm doing right now, or planning to do in the next few years on regulatory science and ignorance production around contaminated, around environmental hazards and land use. Urban land use is very much, I think, aligns with that understanding.
Last question before we address places, scales, and time. In your writings on ignorance, since the beginning, you are a bit critical of approaches such as proctors or arrest cases, or sometimes underlining what you call a conspiratorial logic. And in a more recent of Lindsay McGaughy's The Unknowers, you stress that the concept of ignorance that is used there is both too wide, because everything will count as ignorance, and too narrow, if there is a stress on a strategic ignorance. And so what is the problem, so that our viewers understand your position? What is the problem of framing things around strategic ignorance?
Well, there's not a problem with it. It's an important element. I mean, it's Lindsay does fantastic work. My point is simply that there is, strategic forms of ignorance where, powerful people are very conscious of what they're doing and using the idea of ignorance for political or economic gain. We know, her work shows exactly how that happens and why it's important. My point is simply that that's not the only way that ignorance gets produced, and it's not the only use of ignorance. And my own focus is on sort of normal organizational or institutional routines that are not trying to hoodwink anybody or not trying to hide anything. They're not purposeful, not purposeful productions of ignorance, but simply the consequence of the way in which epistemic machinery is organized and run. And so I think in many ways that they're complementary. and my critique goes only that far. It's not a particularly strong critique. I don't think there's anything wrong with what she's done. I mean, she's done us a great service, but it's narrow in the sense that it focuses on this sort of self-conscious manipulation, and I would argue that there's a lot more going on than just that.
Yeah. So in fact, you argue for a fuller, larger account, because when we think of it, every strategy relies on features on the environment that are not intentional, that are not strategic. If I'm going, I don't know, I don't hunt, but if I was hunting, that's intentional, but there are many features in the environment. Is there some game around? What's the weather like? And so to understand that practice, we would need to integrate all these factors. If we move to space, I would refer our viewers to your chapter, both in the 2.15 and to the revised version in the 2.22 version in the Handbook of Ignorance Studies, coordinated by Lindsay McGoey and Mathias Gross. And you have this paper, Lost in Space, Place, Space, and Scale in the Production of Ignorance. And that's striking, and perhaps we can move to examples too, because when we think of it abstractly, we could say that space is an order where everything is present, everything is visible. That would be an abstract view. And you show that if we want to understand empirically how ignorance is produced, we have to pay attention to spaces. We have to take into account places and perhaps more importantly, scales. And so how is that possible? If our viewers want to understand that, what do we point to them?
Yeah, well, some of these ideas come out of my early work in New Orleans and in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, which we touched on earlier, which is that, and I basically in that sort of personal experience back in New Orleans in the years following the storm, was paying attention to how the Environmental Protection Agency was conducting soil and sediment sampling around the city, testing those samples, and then developing hazard assessments of those test results to determine that the city was safe, and there weren't pressing environmental concerns, and encourage people to move back to the city. And I really treated that early work as just as a simple accounting process. I asked very basic questions. Where in the city are they collecting samples? What is the sampling array? What are the patterns that come out of that sampling array? When do they sample? Because the project, their risk assessment project spanned an entire year. And so when are they going out and doing this kind of field work to collect samples? What are they testing for? It turns out that at different times of year, with different phases of sampling, they were looking for different chemicals, different hazards. And so what was determining that? And then, mapping those spatially across the urban landscape, revealed quite simply that there were huge segments of the city that were not getting any sampling. And so, that just watching that process unfold, talking to people, interviewing people who were doing the work, and listening to their sort of how they described their work, got very basic. Like I asked someone, one of the people who was out collecting samples, what if you turn down a street and there are trees down and you can't access the street? What do you do? And he said, yeah, we just, we figure something out, we go somewhere else. So the systematic, protocol for sampling was in some ways perturbed by the spatial conditions on the ground. Land use also, prior land use also constrained or sort of guided where and when and how the scientists took samples. And it was interesting to me that they have avoided industrial areas because people weren't living in those places. And so, which seemed to me to kind of ignore the problem that floods can move contaminants from one place to another. Anyways, just watching that process play out gave me a sharp sense of how ignorance can take spatial forms. And that's what I was trying to show in some of those early papers on Katrina. And then, in the paper that you mentioned with Abby Kinchy, we also talk about scale. And, one of the things that I think is important, and it's also something that I came across in my post-Katrina study, is that how data are presented produces forms of ignorance. That is, if you aggregate data to a higher scale, you obscure questions or answers to questions that local residents might care about. Conversely, if you provide completely disaggregated data, it can be very difficult for people to understand and make sense of that data. So, and that's what happened in the EPA case. They made the data that they collected publicly available in two different ways. One as raw data and data sets that I think even experienced toxicologists would have trouble understanding how to use and make sense of, but it was there. And then the other way was in these very short summary reports that gave very sort of broad brush, painted broad brush pictures of the environmental conditions across the whole city, but didn't give any one person or any one place enough sort of detail to actually tell people whether their neighborhood was at risk or not. So, ignorance is kind of, you can use data aggregation methods to obscure information or to obscure patterns in different ways. And so I think that's a sort of an interesting way to come at this again. Again, very empirical, as you suggested earlier.
That were some great examples. If our viewers want to get still more concrete ideas about scale, I think that in the paper you mentioned Fukushima and the fact that people just at the individual level were equipped with déjà counters and this kind of thing. So how do we lose information, or how do we make something invisible if we just use that as a kind of input?
Right. I mean, so individual level data collection, isn't going to really help to understand aggregate patterns, right?
Okay, so that was for space, and it's interesting because space with you is not where everything is shown. It hides and makes invisible as well. And in the same way, in your work, we have a feeling that time never flies. The past, or I would rephrase that, the past is never really over. And when we think of pollution, or better, of urban and industrial toxins. And could you tell us how your more recent work on, for example, on sites unseen, or papers, even more recent papers on gas work lost and found. How it's connected to your former inquiries into ignorance, and how the element of time and succession plays a tremendous role in your approach.
Yeah, thank you. So in the in more recent years, I've been doing a lot of work with graduate students and postdoctoral students or fellows to develop ways to access historical documents and retrieve or recover what I would call lost knowledge from those historical documents. So we've developed computational tools to extract information from historical manufacturing directories and city directories, essentially telephone books, to identify where and when hazardous land uses took place in urban settings. Most recently, I've been working on this project to develop these historical or longitudinal geolocated databases in Providence, Rhode Island, where I live now. And so we've managed to develop a database that has identified, it's essentially an inventory of every industrial manufacturer that has operated in the state of Rhode Island since the early 1950s. And so we have about 60 or 70, almost 70 years of information about where these activities took place, what happened, insofar as we have information about the industrial sector in which they're involved, the work is involved, and we also know when they closed down. So we can sort of develop an interactive mapping of what I would call the sort of environmental geography of hazardous land use across an entire state over a period of several decades. Using city directories, we've done a similar thing, looking at what we would call retail hazards. So gas stations, auto repair shops, paint stores, dry cleaners, places that store and use large quantities of hazardous material, even if they're not manufacturing those things. And we've done the same thing. So we have these two longitudinal databases that we can then compare to, or not compare, but append to or pair with census data. And then we can understand how neighborhood composition, demographic composition changes at the neighborhood scale over time, as sort of industrial land uses shift around an urban landscape. So the point of the empirical point of the project is to develop a very fine-grained historical detail on hazardous or industrial land uses and demographic change in relation to those sort of economic activities. Now, with respect to ignorance, this project, I mean, at a very sort of basic empirical level, we are recovering historical information that has essentially been lost and is not present in the current regulatory environment. And so I would say that the current project that I'm doing is in some ways in some very basic ways, it's addressing ignorance as an environmental problem by recovering lost information and then studying that empirically and analytically, studying the data that comes from that knowledge retrieval that we're doing. But it also, again, going back to the Katrina work, it allows us to map concentrations and diffusions of risk around an urban landscape. And then what we can do, which I'm working on now, is to look at the regulatory documents to see which sites regulatory agencies have investigated as potential sources of environmental hazards or contamination, and then compare our sort of historical baseline data, because we know what land uses were happening in particular periods of time. And now we're developing a similar sort of archival or retrieval project to understand what the Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management knows about those places. What sorts of investments have they made in which parcels of land, what they've looked for, what they've found, what sort of remediation plans they've made. And so in this way, I'm coming kind of full circle to this question of how institutions, in the course of standardized, codified, regulated knowledge production practices in the regulatory domain, are simultaneously producing forms of ignorance that are essentially invisible to them, because it's not purposeful, it's not intentional, but also to the larger society and to the city and citizens.
Yeah, that's fascinating, because we see when we hear you and when we read you that you are not only pointing to undone science, but you actually had to produce the knowledge that was not available or not retrieved by the EPA or other institutions. And so there is a very concrete empirical informational work on old maps, for example, or this kind of things. And so, yeah, there is both the negative element. You are pointing to gaps, and I would refer our viewers to this wonderful paper on absence, and we'll give the reference below the video. So there is this empirical work, and also it can change some of our preconceptions, because for example, if we think of occupation, there could be this idea that there is some environmental injustice. And of course, there is some. The poor are always more subject to it. But when we read you with this ecological succession, this what you call urban or industrial churning, we can see that the rich too are exposed to pollution under the playground or the fancy buildings, and so this element of time changes everything, because pollution is everywhere. It's coming from the past, and since it's growing larger and larger, we are all in it or subject to it or exposed to it. So it changes a lot of other conceptions in terms of justice or relationship to environment, I think.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we think about environmental justice or inequality as an outcome. But I think what the work that my colleagues and I are doing in this space on socio-environmental succession and sort of urban industrial land use really sort of shows us that environmental inequality is a dynamic process. And it is changing. It changes all the time. And that, the other piece of that, a lot of the existing studies in the US on environmental inequality are using government databases that are very incomplete and so they don't provide the kind of historical inventory of data that our work does. So when you study the actually historically existing hazardous land uses, the results are quite different. And so and not in a good way, right? I mean, more people. Our argument is that our argument is that more and more people are exposed to these hazards over time. And I think climate change also is going to is going to exacerbate these problems as flooding increases in many places.
You mentioned the element of time, and I think that this element plays a role in another close notion, the notion of residue. And I would just mention here a part of your work that is collective. As we've seen, you have co-authored numerous texts and edited books or chapters. But I'm thinking of a more recent work. You are or were part of a team working on residues. And some of the authors, Soraya Boudia, Nathalie Jas, Emmanuel Henry, or Carsten Reinhardt, are well known here. And so just ask you, how important is this kind of collaboration in your work, and what kind of interactions do you have with these colleagues for this work on residue? Because in residue, it's not pollution, as you explain in the collective paper. The element of time is important. The residue is what is left still with us from former pollution.
Yeah. I mean, residue. The concept is very much about the presence, the ever-presence of history, the ever-presence of the past. I mean, the collaboration was and is lovely. My co-authors in that book are just wonderful people, and we had so much fun working together and writing this short essay. And it was really a nice the way in which our work collectively could come together to inform, a perspective on chemicals in society that I think, none of us could have written that book on our own. It really required a collective approach. I will say there is a part of that book where we or there's a paragraph in that book where we reference ignorance. It's not about ignorance per se, but the argument about residue and in the material, the socio-material nature of residue, of chemical residue in particular, draws into question the ontological status of ignorance. And we sort of wave our hands at this a little bit, but I think it's an area of really important and interesting future work that people should take seriously. These residues are almost infinitely small as molecules, and yet they are material things, and they have real material consequences and effects. And they are also not stable, right? They cut loose in the environment, they change, they transform, and they transform the world. And so it brings to question the fields, the focus of ignorance studies on the epistemological question of knowledge. I think residues adds or raises the question of the ontological status of ignorance and the form, material or otherwise, the form that ignorance takes. So we could go back to the early work that I did in New Orleans about the spatial nature of ignorance. That would be one sort of way to come at sort of ontological questions around ignorance. But I think residue is another very potentially very useful way to sort of begin thinking about not just what we know, but what we have, what ignorance is, right? In a material form, in a material sense, or socio-material sense.
Thanks. Okay, and so perhaps one last question before we wrap things up. Yeah. What's next in your line of work, or what are you working on at this time?
Well, I've mentioned the work with the regulatory agency here in Rhode Island. So that will be one major project that I'm beginning to develop. I'm also working collaboratively with an Argentinian sociologist, Florencia Arancibia, who has studied expert activism or scientist activism in Argentina around the pesticide conflict and glyphosate use in rural areas in Argentina. And so we've developed a sort of a companion project where we are studying the experts who are involved in that, who have become involved in that movement, and are beginning to work on a book about the ways in which different Argentinian professionals have organized and mobilized both for and against the pesticide conflict in Argentina. I'll stop there. That's enough.
No,
And we're also doing the gaswork stuff that you alluded to is also another interesting sort of piece of the current work.
So I think we've covered a lot of ground. Thanks to you. Is there something that we would have left out, or that you would like to add at the end of this interview? Something that we didn't address or that would be important?
Well, I just, I did want to just, I think I wanted to signal the sort of ontological aspect of ignorance as being, I think, an important question to consider in future work. I also just want to underscore the continued importance of ignorance studies. And I think we are, it is true that we now have a field, and it's not just, ignorance is not just an academic fad anymore, but it is a settled field. And I think it's really important that that has happened. And I just want to thank you and everybody else who's been involved in this work, because it addresses, it's a way in which science studies can and should address the question of power in society. I think it's an element of power that is itself understudied, and so somebody needs to be doing this work.